Nate, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is R.Deni, as Nate mentioned. I'm a professor here at the SSI, part of the U.S. Army War College. Our opening panel today, in conjunction with the opening keynote that you just heard, is designed to try to set the strategic context for joint force missioning and capabilities development. The panel, this first panel, will lay, hopefully, a contextual foundation for focused regional and functional discussions that will follow later today and then tomorrow. Now, some of the questions we're hoping to get at with this panel specifically include, what are the foundational trends of the strategic environment over the next 5 to 7 years? How do these trends square with current defense policy developments? And how will these trends combine to generate military demands? Now, for this panel, we've partnered with the National Intelligence Council, and we're grateful for their collaboration in helping to put this group together. My primary partner in crime in this regard has been Dan Flynn at the far end. Dan's the director of the Global Security Program for the NICS Strategic Futures Group. As part of his duties, Dan's involved in the development of the NICS Global Trends Report, including the most recent Global Trends 2030 Alternative Worlds. I'm going to hop around in terms of introductions then in the order in which our panelists will speak to you. Two seats down from Dan is Brigadier Rigden. He's the head of land and research for the Development, Concepts, and Doctrine Center within the British MOD, where he was the lead author for the Defense Joint Operating Concept, published just last month. He's a 2008 graduate of the U.S. Army War College here in Carlisle, and somewhat ironically, he's the only member of our panel who can claim to be an honorary colonel in the Commonwealth of Kentucky Militia. Seated just to my left is retired Marine Lieutenant General Chip Gregson, most recently serving as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Previously, he served as Commanding General of Marine Forces Pacific and Marine Forces Central Command. And then Dr. Richard Betts, 3 seats down from me, is a professor of war and peace studies in the political science department at Columbia University. He's also director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the International Security Policy Program, both at Columbia. Previously, he served as director of national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a member of the staff member of the National Security Council. Without further ado, I'll ask Dan at the far end to kick us off.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank the conference organizers and John for inviting me to participate in this panel, as well as inviting the National Intelligence Council to be a participant in this conference. John asked me to talk about everything you need to know about the future and keep it to less than 10 minutes. So, never one to refuse a challenge. I'll do my best. Luckily, Robert Kaplan really set the stage well for what I'm about to say. But clearly, when we're thinking about the future decision-making environments, it's important to think about where we might be headed in the future so we're not just reacting to events. I'm going to be taking most of my remarks from the NICS Global Trends 2030 report. It's online. It's a free document, so if you want to look deeper into some of these trends, please check it out. But like the report says, I'm not here to predict the future. What I'm hoping to do is provide an analytical framework for thinking about the future and the security challenges that may lie ahead. Even though we live in a very uncertain environment with a lot of rapid change, there are some things that we feel more certain about than others. These we call the mega trends in our document. One is demography. If you look at long-term demographic trends, there's going to be about 1 billion more people in the world over the next 20 years. Most of those people will be living in urban environments. We're having societies, especially in Western Europe, in parts of East Asia, Japan, and South Korea, that are having aging societies. By 2030, their median age will be over 45 years. There is still going to be youth bulges, but there'll be not as many as there are today in 20 years from now, which is a good thing because youth bulges has been associated with instability. But they'll still exist in some of the troubled spots in the world, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of South Asia. With all those people in the world, there'll be new demands for resources, and that's the next mega trend. We expect food demands to rise by 35% over the next 20 years, water demand up by 40%, and energy demands by 50%. Nearly half the world's population will live in areas of water stress in the future. And fragile states in the Middle East and Africa will be at risk for food and water shortages unless technologies can solve some of these problems. As was mentioned, the U.S. is in a pretty good position in terms of energy because of our shale gas and oil, but states like India and China will be increasingly looking for energy energy in the future and reliant on outside sources. Third megatrend is the diffusion of power. This is not an argument about U.S. decline in the world. The U.S. will still remain an important power, but there will be more important actors on the world stage, each able to influence events. And we're seeing diffusion of power not only among states, but within states. New non-state actors are being created, emerging, able to create new events, disrupt societies, and this is a part of the diffusion that we'll have to manage. It makes managing global security challenges that much more difficult. And the last important trend is the empowerment of individuals. We see the rise of the global middle class. It's expanding exponentially in the future. This could be a good thing because it'll demand more and better governance, could lead to more democratic transitions. But if those demands are unmet by weak governments, it could create further instabilities in the future. Now, these megatrends are associated with a number of things that we call game changers. These are the uncertainties about the future, and I don't have time to go into each one of these, but for briefly, they're the economy, the global economy, whether it's going to continue to get better or there'll be periods of stagnation. Governance, will governments in the world adapt to these changes that I've talked about, or will they be overwhelmed by it? And technology, will it provide solutions or more disruptive problems? In addition, we have regional instability, where those will expand or be contained, and the potential for conflict in the future, whether we'll see a rise in the conflict. If you look at these trends, they can be grouped in two big categories. The first three really talk about the capacity of major states in the international system to deal with these emerging challenges. Will they have the capacity? Will they have the willingness to do it? And the last two talk about the character of international relations itself, whether we're moving to a more competitive world or a more cooperative world. And when you use these two uncertainties to create a kind of 4x4 matrix, 2x2 matrix, 4 scenarios about the future, we have state capacities in the vertical axis going from high state capacity to low state capacity in the bottom, and then a cooperative and competitive world in the horizontal axis. And let me go through each of these briefly. If you are living in a world of high state capacity, but it's cooperative, then you have this, what I call the concert of powers world, where a growing number of these important actors in the world actually brings stability and ability to deal with security challenges. Now, how might this come about? Well, you have major powers who have to convince that their economic well-being is really associated with a stable security environment and a stable energy market, and they're more willing to cooperate to achieve that than try to upset the environment. And rising middle-class expectations on governments causes states to spend more on domestic spending and less on defense. So if you ended up with this kind of world, the security implications would be soft power becomes more important than hard power. You'll have new coalitions of states working to address global security challenges, most likely help led and put together by the United States. Most of those security challenges would be in things like humanitarian operations and peacekeeping, and reduced defense spending around the world, but that could introduce risk if you have unexpected contingencies emerge. The opposite of that is where you have a world of weak state powers and a competitive environment. And this is a fragmented international system where burden fatigue in the West, lack of international consensus makes handling global security challenges very difficult. So you see further proliferation of weapons and nuclear capabilities, resource scarcities overwhelm governments to deal with them. The security implications here is you have more instability probably in the greater Middle East, South Asia, other parts of Asia, and you have challenges caused by weak states that may have WMD arsenals, building missile capabilities among these states against missile defense systems, and the risk of regional crises escalating to more global implications. If you have a world of weak states and poor governance, but relatively cooperation between the states, and then you see the rise of non-state networks. These are networks that really come in place where states cannot govern well, and they're either there to help solve these problems or create more problems. So you see breakups into various sub-state entities based along ethnic or religious rivalries. In this kind of future, the United States military would have to learn how to work with some of these non-state actors, NGOs, religious organizations, to help solve some of the problems in the world. On the security side, we're mostly faced in this kind of world with transnational threats, terrorism, international crime, irregular warfare is dominating the kind of security agenda that we see. The biggest problem we'll probably see is the disruptive capabilities, things like precision strike weapons, bioweapons, and cyber being proliferated down to the individual and small group level to cause chaos. And finally, of a world of great powers that are capable but competitive, then we see growing energy competition and other resource competition leading to a rise of nationalism. States see a zero-sum game for influence in resources and markets. There's a lack of confidence in global institutions to solve these problems, so they take the agenda in their own hands, and you see the rise of military budgets, especially in East Asia. High potential for interstate confrontation in this kind of world. This is a world of advanced conventional weapons, long-range missiles, precision capabilities, air and sea battle, and other non-military forms of warfare, information warfare, and competition. So what can you do with this kind of framework? Well, obviously none of these futures are going to be the real future. The real future will probably be some combination. The way I like to think about it is this framework's the map of the future. These are the four corners of the map, and our path will actually be some way through it. But you can start playing with this kind of framework to think about risk and opportunities. For instance, if your strategy is based totally on fighting non-state actors, how much risk are we assuming if we actually end up in a great power confrontation world? And is that risk manageable? Or on the opposite, if we assume a great power confrontation, say with China, are we foregoing opportunities for cooperation with China that might exist and that we need to really think about and take advantage of? You can also think about where we are in this kind of framework. My personal opinion, where we've been, is on the lower half of that framework. We're dealing with non-state threats in a very fragmented international system where it's hard to get the international community to solve problems of common concern. The question is where we go next. Actions in Crimea and the tensions in the East China Sea and South China Sea are worrisome signs that we might be heading towards that great power confrontation. But is that necessarily the future that we're dealing with? I think the key thing in this strategic environment decision-making environment that we're going to be in the next decade is really where we want to be on this map, where we want to go. Can we shape the future in ways that we think are most beneficial and avoid conflict? And in this ways, I think this decade will be just as important as the second decade of last century in determining what comes next in the security environment. If we are going to manage our way out of these problems, I think these are the four things that we need to really think about how we deal with diffusion of power in the international system. Can we build new coalitions of the willing? Can we build new partnerships along with our existing allies to solve some of these problems? Or will we have continued fragmentation? Can we solve the competition for resources through technology or policies so there is not a sense of turning that into a military competition? Can we keep the most disruptive technologies away from bad actors? And finally, do we have the right tools and strategies to prevent conflicts when they do occur from escalating and becoming global problems? So I'll end it here, and I'll pass it on. John?
Thank you very much. Brigadier Rigden, over to you.
Indeed.
Sorry.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. It's wonderful to be back here at my old alma mater, the US Army War College, and particularly in this hall, Bliss Hall, which we all affectionately called when I was here the big red sleeping bag. And hopefully what I'm about to say won't put you in that particular mode. What I'm going to do today is to talk about setting the strategic context for defense and security. It ties very much in with the things that Dan has said. What I'm going to try and do is paint a picture of how we see in the UK with our global strategic trends work, how the future might look, and some of the implications for the utility of military force and its use. I'm going to start off with a great American man of letters and writing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, with the great quote that not in his goals but in his transitions is man great. We're in a process of transition now, and we're always in a process of transition. As the world changes, as the Earth changes in terms of its geography, global climate change, global warming, etc., there are transitions there that we have to be in tune with and we have to link in. And we will be judged, both this generation and the next generation that fall on beyond that, as to how we have transitioned into that environment. What is more important, I think, is that the future is uncertain. It's more uncertain than it has been perhaps in the past. And based on what Dr. Robert Kaplan was saying earlier on, we're in an era now where it's very difficult to actually decide exactly where that balance of power lies. What we're trying to do with our work, as all the panelists are here, is to try and give us a slightly clearer picture of where we might be. And I come back to a point that was raised yesterday. It's very difficult to predict the future exactly. You can get close and you can identify areas and trends which we may end up having to deal with. But to get it exactly is very difficult. And the point that Thomas Hammes made yesterday in one of the panels, what was interesting is that even if we do understand what the future might look like, we don't always act on it. We might have that information, but we don't act on it. We need to get better at doing that. My next point is the bottom line up front, and that is simply that the centrality of understanding power and influence into everything that we do, the model that we use, the model of statecraft, the geography really does matter, but particularly human geography. We came up with a construct of the human domain, which I'll talk more about in questions later if people are interested. This was in 2009-10. What we were trying to do is to say that actually human actor is the center. That is the center of all the way that we should look at problems, rather than just looking specifically at the physical environment. Human actors in the cultural environment, shaped by that physical environment, is the bit that we should be focusing on. In the military, agility and flexibility are going to be core to the way that we do things. These are very easy terms to throw away, but they do have a specific meaning, and I'll come back to that more later. And finally, the argument for mass is actually about depth and resilience. That is the argument for it. It's not about mass per se. You raise mass, and in budgetary terms, that is not a very popular option. Is there a reason why we need that mass? Yes, but it is for depth and resilience. It's to survive strategic shock and be able to operate post that shock. Just a quick couple of snapshots. The change of the world's economic center of gravity. You can see here on this map, AD 1 period to about 1000, up to about 1820, is pretty much in one area. It's moved incredibly rapidly over the period of time. And the rate of change of that economic center of gravity moving back more towards the east again, has changed significantly since the 1820 period. And that rate of change will probably increase further towards the east over the next few years. Population growth, estimates vary between 8.5 billion and 9.2 billion by 2050. To give you some idea of comparative populations, on the figures that we're working on, the population of Nigeria will be 390 million by 2050, the population of the United States 420 million. The population of India will exceed that of China, 1.7 billion by 2050, as opposed to 1.4 billion, if projections carry on the way they're carrying at the moment. That, of course, is variable. When I was a young officer in Hong Kong in 1982, looking across the Hong Kong border to old Shenzhen, that's what it looked like. What it looks like today is this, and that's only in 32 years. A significant change. The pace of urbanization around the world is significant. But I would raise one issue about this, and that is that we tend to focus, because it sounds important, on the issue of mega cities, those cities over 20 million. What we must remember, I think, is not so much the mega city, it's actually the age of that city. Because the cities, even if they're mega cities and they're created on an old city, the structure they have and the governance they have within them probably is fairly robust. The real issue is mega cities that grow that are new, which don't have quite that resilience and that depth within those cities. I would also raise, of course, the issue of slum towns, non-planned urbanization, which of course will be significant in the future. And again, these are very big issues that need to be dealt with and will increase. Only if you read Out of the Mountains by Dave Cullen, some very interesting statistics on how quickly that growth might happen within that era. But how do you operate in something like that, whether you're civil government or whether you're military? Resources. Resources, and particularly water, with a population of 9.2 billion, that is a significant issue. The water table in Beijing has dropped by 300 meters in the last 20 years because of the increased use on that water table. And that's only one example of many. We need to be very specific about how we look at resources. Now, looking at this specifically, you could actually say also that everything is doom and gloom. Well, of course, climate change is one example of that. We're estimating that the mean temperature in the world will increase by 1 degree C by 2045 on best estimate, but could be as high as 2 degrees, and that is plausible. The water levels will rise by between 0.2 meters and 0.59 meters. But if the Arctic ice continues to melt and large quantities of methane are released, that could increase as much as 2 meters. Now, depending on where you live, and especially if you live at sea level, that is a bit of an issue. And you can do one of three things. You can be very negative about it. You can bury your head in increasingly wet sand and say, it's not going to happen to me. You can build your house 200 foot above sea level next to a wood so you can build a raft and call yourself Noah. Or more specifically, you can actually rely on the transitional nature of our civil engineers and how they might perhaps deal with some of this issue. If you look at places like Hong Kong with land reclamation, seawalls, etc., there are ways around some of these issues, and we tend to look at them fairly negatively. What will be definitely an increase will be flooding. And these are the sort of cities, those in red particularly, that will be affected by flooding on a more regular basis. And therefore, it's reasonable to assume that military forces may become involved more in areas like humanitarian disaster relief, in areas where this happens. But on the good side, of course, there are things like renewable energy and alternatives. There are improvements in agriculture, particularly things like genetic modification, and we can become more efficient. So there are plus sides to things that we need to focus on, but of course it takes resourcing and effort to focus on those areas. In terms of technology, big data. The amount of data that's out there and will be out there during our lifetime and our children's lifetime is enormous. We call this information anarchy. There's so much information out there. How do you cut to the quick? It's like when you join the military looking at your Ishihara test for your iCard test, trying to identify what the number is in the middle with different shades of color. That is the problem, I think, with big data. How do you utilize that to your advantage? Processing power has increased significantly. Only in 2002, the processing power of the average computer was the brain of a spider. In the current era, and out to 2020, we anticipate it's going to be the brain power of a mouse. By 2050, it'll be 300 times the brain power of the human brain. Now, if you have an opponent who's working in that spectrum, using that brain power to their advantage, if it was based on my brain power, you wouldn't have an issue. You'd be able to sort it out pretty quickly. If it was based on the brain power of Thomas Jefferson, you might have a bit of an issue. And it brings all sorts of images of, for example, HAL in 2001, the computer controlling. We've let Pandora's box out. Cyberspace is a big entity. We have very little control over it, and less control as time goes on. And processing power and the ability to get things done can be to our advantage, but it may also be a disadvantage to us if we're not inside that cycle. In terms of technology, three very quick things. Internet uptake, significant. It's anticipated in sub-Saharan Africa, the intake by 2045, 90% of people in sub-Saharan Africa will have internet access. IP addresses and the Internet of Things, these are increasing rapidly. So whereas IP addresses today are a very limited number, they will grow probably by as much as 200% over the next 30 years. And surveillance. Surveillance will be everywhere. Even when you get onto the net, they'll be able to identify where you are and where you've been calling from very quickly. There is one other aspect, though, on technology, and that is that our asymmetric adversaries may well work outside that. So the possibility of working what I call on the grid and off the grid, i.e. working on the internet when they want to, but stepping out of it to pass messages in the old ways, is a very real possibility. And we have to be able to cater for both of those. Automation, automatic, in terms of automation, in terms of robots, we will do things which we can't do. They do it a lot better. And one of the things in the future, perhaps, the future of humanity, will it be that actually jobs are for the elite, or that they're created for purpose creation? These are things that perhaps we do need to consider as we go through. Freedom of the state, more dependent on others, more use of international institutions, but the multinational corporations and NGOs will grow bigger and more powerful over this period. Conflict will endure. What's interesting, though, if you look at the pattern of conflict, apart from the big blips of World War I and World War II, actually deaths due to violence have decreased significantly. And that may sound counterintuitive to our experiences over recent years, but that is certainly the truth based on facts and figures over the last 20 years and perhaps projecting it into the future. But the forms of warfare will change, and so more use of technology perhaps over the deployment of manpower. And finally, in terms of the future character of conflict, this great quote by Sir Michael Howard, now in his 90s, is very apposite. We can't get it exactly, but we need to be as close as we can so that we can adapt and move quickly on to deal with the issue at hand. The national challenges in the contemporary operating environment will remain. And these are just some of them: terrorism, hostile states, fragile failing states, hybrid adversities and threats. And the bottom one in particular is the one that we need to focus on. And sometimes the enemy we look at isn't the same adversaries we've dealt with in the past. Some of the organization, their abilities, are like states within states. So you have to look at Hamas and Hezbollah just to give an example of how that might be. And I think this particular comment is a very interesting assessment of the sort of future adversaries we might have to deal with in that hybrid adversarial mix. The idea of campaign themes, going on a campaign. Charles Krulak said this years ago, the three-block war, but actually it's very complex. Here, for example, top left-hand corner, piracy, Mexican drug cartels, Lord's Resistance Army, insurgents, terrorism. You can have all of those things in one area, as we found to our cost in Iraq in the early days. All of these things can happen. So the idea of planning for a campaign on one particular adversary or one particular problem is not very realistic. We have to think much wider than that. The strategic game changers, the role of the US and the US position in the world. We've heard some excellent presentation this morning, particularly Mr. Kaplan, but also China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all the usual suspects in some respects as to how we need to understand and who we need to deal with. But all of those will have a significant effect on the way. I'm going to finish off just very quickly with one final thing, which is on the use of military power and how we see that in the future. What is the purpose of military power? Well, I think it's around three things. The first is defense of the homeland for both your nation and for our nation. The second is on the ability to project power to protect national interests. The third is forward engagement, to give us that understanding that allows us to do the first two. And that forward engagement applies equally internally to the domestic audience as it does externally to an external audience. And we do that for three reasons. One is to understand the environment. The second is to inform what we're going to do through the actions we take. And everything we do, whether it is going to war or whether it is peacekeeping, is done for a reason, and that is to influence. And we do that because we maintain the strategic initiative, which allows us to learn, to adapt to the environment we face, to act in the right way with the intelligent application of power, and finally to achieve an effect that allows us to exploit that to further better our position within that international environment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. General Gregson, the floor is yours.
Wow, it's always a challenge to follow a very accomplished and clever British officer. Thanks to the Institute for inviting me back here, and I'm happy to be able to meet with you all. Given the potential of duty assignments for War College graduates, I think the topic today is absolutely fundamental and can't be more important. And we were asked to address the foundational trends in the strategic environment. First foundational trend I would offer is to understand our own situation. We do not do strategy well. And this is for a number of strategic and cultural reasons. A quick Google search on the web pulls up a DoD definition of strategy: a prudent idea for employing the instruments of national power in a synchronized and integrated fashion to achieve theater, national, or multinational objectives. Prudent indeed. Nowhere in that definition appears the word resources or the word means at any place. But in any rational world, national resources or budget or money is an instrument of national power. And this is the second fundamental trend. Resources are going down. We always talk about, well, we'll get the money for this, we'll get the money for that. Not likely. Resources are going down, and nobody in a position of responsibility in today's DoD, in today's government, and certainly in today's military has experienced anything for the past 10, 15 years except constantly rising budgets. Managing in a time of declining resources is an entirely different challenge, and we need to come to grips with it. From academia, particularly Elliot Cohen at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, is a strategy definition. A strategy is the art of choice that binds means with objectives. It is the highest level of thinking about war, and it involves priorities. We'll devote resources here and take them away from here, even if it means starving operations. Sequencing, we'll do this first and then that, obviously. In a theory of victory, we will succeed for the following reasons. He goes on to say that that's the job of wartime presidents, and that's why they have the title Commander-in-Chief. Summarizing Elliott Cohen, a proper strategy is critical assumptions, ends, ways, means, coherence, priorities, sequencing, and a theory of victory. If you've spent 10 minutes in Washington, you know that careless usage of terms have corrupted our understanding of what strategy should mean to national security. We apply the word strategy to nearly everything in both the private sector and in government. Inside the government, the word strategy is often applied to unobjectionable lists of aspirations washed through the interagency process to make sure that we're not offending anybody. As for comprehensive and new, which we always apply to a strategy, that's the well-worn thing of my product is new, it's not like my predecessor, and it's much better. Perhaps the best and perhaps only example of U.S. strategy development starts with George F. Kennan and his long telegram from Moscow. Remember that in those days, the Soviet Union was our ally in World War II, and in 1945, late 1945, 1946, we felt there was nobody left to fight. It took the blockade of Berlin, the de facto annexation of much of Eastern Europe, the testing of an atomic weapon, and Mao's victory over another wartime ally, Chiang Kai-shek, all between 1945 and 1950, to convince us that national security threats had not been permanently banished on VE and VJ Day. Kennan's 1947 message persuasively described Soviet intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. It was challenged from many quarters, inside and outside of government, but it provided the essential foundation for our strategy, containment, and it was a political and an economic strategy. Rollback was vigorously proposed by some, but eventually it was rejected. USSR had a vast geographic sanctuary and nuclear weapons. Russia still has that, as does China. The document called NSC 68 set us on course for the existential struggle of the 20th century and for many hot campaigns within that otherwise Cold War. Ironically, Kennan went to his grave convinced that we had overly militarized his creation. Looking out over the next 5 to 7 years, another fundamental trend is that China is not the new Soviet Union. Russia, even given her economic ties, is not the new Soviet Union. China is the fastest rising power in world history. Every one of our allies and friends has a very important economic relationship with China. We sponsored China's accession to the World Trade Organization. It is settled U.S. policy that the U.S. supports China's peaceful rise and successful reintegration into the international system. Perhaps during the quasi-war with France in 1789 to 1800 or the War of 1812, we had conflict with an economic partner. Certainly we have no living memory of that over the last 70 years. This new situation, an economic partner that is also the source of many security concerns, will require far more skill and subtlety on our part than we have demonstrated previously. Other fundamental trends include the vast geographic sanctuaries enjoyed by Russia, China, and even Iran. At least 2 of these have nuclear weapons, a fact that has become a guarantee against regime change. Another is that, as I mentioned before, for the first time in decades, our resources are declining. We can no longer compensate for our lack of decision by buying a little bit of everything and hoping it all works out in the end. Therefore, we need our allies and friends more than ever before. The relationship will be different. The Cold War is over. We're no longer the quarterback of Team Free World, and we unilaterally call the signals and everybody lines up. We have to learn to work with our allies and friends increasingly on matters of their concern, not matters of our concern. Asian nations, particularly Southeast Asia, are the fastest growing group of powers in world history with unsettled boundaries. And I agree with the 2 previous speakers on the trends, particularly water scarcity, that can combine to create conflicts. The Muslim world is an Asian world. The population there overwhelms the Muslim population in the Middle East. The world's largest Muslim populations within single national boundaries are in Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and Malaysia. 70% of Persian Gulf oil is exported to Asia. Even with a pivot or a realignment or rebalance to Asia, it's going to be impossible to get Asia anywhere near right unless we have some degree of stability in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. So therefore, the idea that we're going to unilaterally withdraw from these areas, I would suggest has to be rethought. Lastly, a few technology things. In World War I, nations went to war in Europe thinking war was impossible because the world was so globally integrated. We went to war anyway, and somehow between the Franco-Prussian War in 1872 and the onset of World War I, we missed the development and the effect of standardized industrial production, railroads, artillery, standardized artillery, railroad-based logistics, barbed wire, and machine guns, and we managed to kill a little bit over 10% of the military-age population of Europe. Linear projections are impossible, as Robert Kaplan mentioned. Not impossible, but it's the only thing we have. But technology now might be the dominance of ubiquitous, pervasive surveillance all over the map and weapons accurate at distance. And Brigadier Rigby mentioned mass comes from depth and resilience. I think with the surveillance that's out there and the weapons accurate at distance, we have to rethink a lot of the traditional ways of operating that we have done before. Thank you. And I'll give you a minute back.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Then our closer, Dr. Betts, the floor is yours.
I'll begin with a side comment on what the General just said about how we do strategy badly. I think that's true, and I think the bad news is that it's for reasons that can't change, because I believe the American Constitution is anti-strategic. It emphasizes the diffusion of power, checks and balances, frequent turnover and authority, all of which foster inconsistency and incoherence and muddling through. And since the Constitution is what it's all about, we have to live with barriers to good strategy. Anyway, with that happy note, I'll focus on assessing the question for the panel more in terms of threats that could draw the United States into political violence in 5 dimensions. First, predictable trends and areas of threat. Second, unpredictable ones. Third, regions where there are both high stakes and instability coinciding. Fourth, adversaries, states or groups that could be violent opponents of U.S. interests. And fifth, sort of technical and functional domains. By predictable areas of threat, I mean the identifiable trends of the sorts we've just been hearing about. But unpredictable ones it's sort of a throwaway that you can't predict and you have to be ready for everything. But I think it's important to realize how crucial unpredictable threats have been. Half of the wars the United States has fought since 1945 were with countries that weren't even on policymakers' radar screens before they happened. Korea in June 1950, Kuwait in 1990, and who, before September 11th, would ever have dreamed that America's longest war would be in Afghanistan? So it doesn't help in a way to say all things are possible, but no one should be overly surprised, although we all will be, if America's next war is in, say, Guyana, because Venezuela does something crazy. I'll bet a month's pay that nobody in this room has spent 10 seconds thinking about the possibility of an American war in Guyana. Anyway, the contingencies and risks that we know would be dangerous and high in priority are in the predictable area. And in terms of regions, I think the answers are fairly obvious. The Middle East and Near East, Northeast Asia, and only recently, more obviously, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Not Latin America or Africa, although the unpredictable side of the ledger could bring those out. The Middle East and Near East, it's just an area we can't get away from. we're getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but Iran, Syria, Egypt, and Pakistan are all potential crisis factories. Northeast Asia, the rebalancing towards Asia, which is sort of uncertain in its current manifestations, but is understandable because East Asia is the new hub of global economy and population. And it's a cockpit of the great powers. China, Japan, Russia, and the United States are all engaged in East Asia. And a rising China, something that could change. It's true that there's every possibility that the Chinese trajectory could change and Chinese development could derail. But if it doesn't, a rising China is the first priority national security challenge for the United States in coming years. Now, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, I think, were passé as a security area of concern after the Cold War. I have to confess, for most of the 20 years after the Cold War, I couldn't really get interested in European security anymore until the recent Ukraine crisis, where I think personally the chickens have come home to roost. NATO pushed the Russians around for 20 years when they were weak after the Cold War, and now Moscow's pushing back. I'd say what happened in Crimea was inexcusable but understandable. And the Ukraine issue, of course, as we see in the headlines every day, isn't over yet. And there are other areas where this sort of problem, which we've got the first wake-up call in Georgia about 6 years ago, but where this sort of problem could break out again. My favorite scare scenario is Estonia, which has a Russian minority, which at least mildly in the past has voiced some grievances about discrimination and so on. It's geographically isolated from Western Europe and close within anything one would think of as a Russian sphere of influence. But now it's a member of NATO, which obligates us in principle to go to war with Russia if something like what happened in Crimea happens in Estonia. And to me it seems these sorts of situations, the risk is a crisis that's provoked neither by Moscow nor by the West, but through internal developments that lead to escalation and miscalculation. Adversaries. They're the minor adversaries, but they're already quite violent, well recognized, and at our throats as much as they can be, and that's essentially Al-Qaeda and similar organizations, allied or franchised forms of them. And Al-Qaeda is like a tapeworm. We've worn it down, but it's constantly recruiting. Will be hard to eliminate, just like crime or disease are hard to eliminate, even if they can be suppressed. But without weapons of mass destruction, and that's, I think, why the focus on ensuring a high priority in preventing terrorist access to weapons of mass destruction is a proper concern. But without weapons of mass destruction, terrorism is not a major threat. It became a major threat in our consciousness after September 11th, first of all because of the psychological shock, and secondly by default, because we had gotten accustomed in the hiatus after the Cold War to not having really major threats to plan against. But major adversaries are potential, not yet actual. That is, major adversaries in terms of great powers that could pose the possibility of war. And here we're focusing essentially on China and Russia. As I think I indicated, I view the reemergence of Russia as an antagonist, as a tragedy. I think we should have been able to reach a modus vivendi after the Cold War, but we haven't, and we'll have to grapple with the consequences. China is the bigger issue for reasons that other panelists have indicated, and I think there the problem is that the United States hasn't decided yet, hasn't had to decide, and there are powerful political and psychological pressures against deciding, but the United States has not decided yet between a focus on containment or accommodation of China. If we really want peace at all costs with China, it seems to me the price is going to be accommodation, and that is recognition of China's natural prerogatives as a superpower, as it's becoming one, when it becomes one. China's been very patient so far. Until the last few years, we've had these wake-up calls in the South China Sea and over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. But China has not yet flexed its muscles in the way that major powers have in the past, or in ways that we take for granted are our prerogative. My concern is not that China is going to act like Wilhelminian Germany, but that China will act like the United States. If China acts in its neighborhood the way the United States has historically been accustomed to acting in our neighborhood, we're in for really big trouble. But we haven't yet decided whether to accept China's dominance by some degree in parts of East Asia, or to essentially adopt a policy of containment, meaning that we will actively try to stop Chinese expansion. The biggest risk, it seems to me, would be an alliance between Russia and China. I think we take too much for granted that the antagonisms between Russia and China are too deeply seated for them to overcome. But it seems to me that the West has been giving strong incentives to both countries to overlook those mutual differences in order to make common cause against the West. And where either one might be a quite manageable challenge together, it's more problematic. Finally, the technical and functional areas of threats that could emerge over the next decade. There are lots of them. I would focus on cybersecurity and weapons of mass destruction. Cybersecurity is the rapidly burgeoning concern of the moment, and properly so. It's well recognized, although the adaptation of policy and strategy to the potential severity of the problem is lagging. While in principle I think the problem is recognized, at least inside the Washington Beltway or in certain financial circles, I don't think it's really sunk in for most Americans. I don't think most people have really pondered the extent to which society has become overwhelmingly dependent, in an unthinking way, dependent on the internet. And therefore, it may not take a cyber Pearl Harbor, some other sort of crisis could change the priority placed on this. Weapons of mass destruction, critical questions really are North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. But I would argue that biological warfare is something we should remain especially concerned with, because while it's not easy to develop potent biological weapons, it's easier than it is to get nuclear weapons, and therefore the smaller threats to American interests might be groups or countries that could move in that direction where the nuclear direction isn't practical. I'll wrap up with a few remarks on implications for U.S. strategy. Seems to me the conventional wisdom is pretty much correct, and that is for conventional warfare concerns, the emphasis will be on air and naval power and a much reduced emphasis on the sorts of wars that the Army is most oriented to handling. And the likeliest action is in the area of unconventional warfare, and that their intelligence and special operations forces of various sorts will be the most crucial. I would conclude by saying that I think concern with weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons, is most crucial, even though the attention we've given to them has declined radically since the Cold War. During the Cold War, that was where all the action in national security was. We spent 2/3 of our time worrying about nuclear weapons. We don't much anymore. But I think as Freddie Clay said before he died, almost everything in society and how the world works has become premised on the non-use of nuclear weapons. We've come, at least unconsciously, to take for granted that nuclear weapons won't be used. And indeed, they haven't been since August 1945. But this is getting to be really old military technology. 69 years old now. And it's unprecedented that military technology remains unused for 69 years. If the first detonation of nuclear weapons occurs in the next decade, it'll change everything in our basic frame of reference.
Thank you, sir. All right, we have about 30 minutes left for Q&A. I would ask that when you ask a question, please identify yourselves. Please keep your questions brief and to the point so we give our audience plenty of time. I know there are probably lots of questions here as well as from our virtual audience, and we want to get as many of those in as we can. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I was formerly a naval control shipping officer in the NATO region, and I'd like to direct this question initially to Brigadier Rigden. And it concerns Article 5 of the NATO Charter. I believe there's only one time in NATO history that's been invoked, and that's the case of Afghanistan, with NATO powers supporting Operation Enduring Freedom. But it was not based upon a conventional attack Afghanistan made on the United States, because the Afghan army did not invade us, certainly didn't send their navy across the ocean to threaten us. It was based upon an asymmetric attack. And also, I believe Dr. Betts had mentioned that if the Russian Federation attacks a NATO member, that would obligate us to go to war with Russia, and I believe that's according to Article 5. And I think that in Ukraine, we do have a certain interest. Ukraine being a non-NATO nation, we're not obligated to it, but I believe that it is strategic in the sense that if Putin took over Sevastopol in order to have a more favorable terms than a lease with Ukraine would give them there, they could expand their presence in the Mediterranean. They have very good terms in the Montreux Convention going through the Turkish Straits for Black Sea nations. But I'm wondering, do you think whether or not Article 5 is sufficient as it is? Because let's say there were a cyber attack on a NATO nation. Not all NATO nations would necessarily agree as to the source and intent of that attack. Is Article 5 sufficient for any future security demands on NATO?
Thanks for that. In terms of answering that question, I think the Article 5, of course, is specifically was based on a conventional attack on another nation or a nuclear attack on another nation within NATO. We changed slightly over Afghanistan because it was seen as an existential threat, either threat of further attacks on the United States mainland or on other NATO countries. And of course, many of us have been had those attacks aimed towards us, Spain and Britain, etc., over that period. Certainly, the way that NATO operates and the way that NATO should operate in the future is under transformation. Kwan is looking at that very closely at the moment, as is SACEUR. What is the future of NATO? How should NATO be structured? How should it react to some of these things? I think one of the key issues that comes out of this is the point you raised about cyber. Cyber, could be argued, has actually changed the nature of war significantly. You can, of course, attack a nation using cyber. We could argue that we're all under attack all day, every day by cyber in some shape or form. The question is how you define that attack, whether it is something that really will completely undermine the way that we live or operate, or is it something that we can tolerate? I agree, I think, that all of us will have a different interpretation by nation as to what that level of tolerance is. I don't think NATO yet would go down the route of saying necessarily that a cyber attack on one is a cyber attack on all, and therefore Article 5 would apply in that circumstance. I'm not convinced that would be the case. That would take considerable change in terms of constitutional change in the way that NATO is constructed to do that. For the future, how we deal with cyber, that is something where the jury's out. There's a lot of work to be done on that.
Yes, in the back here, please. Sir, can you press the button on the mic?
Sorry. My name is Joseph Schneider. In 140 AD, Rome achieved total peace in its empire. From that moment on, the least safe job in the Roman Empire was that of Roman emperor. Of the 39 emperors that followed Hadrian, only 4 died of natural causes. Today, the United States has achieved, is the sole superpower, has achieved unprecedented relative strength versus adversaries and allies. What sort of bad strategic choices can the U.S. make that would undermine the global stability on which the world depends for the United States?
Who would like to take a stab at that?
Well, personally, I think that it's not in the interest of the United States to keep promoting the idea that we are in charge of world order. This is a minority view, and it's not consistent with the mainstream of American foreign policy. But I think our allies and others, we shouldn't expect to step up to the bar and do their share of promoting stability as long as they've gotten used to, as we have, relying on Uncle Sam to do the heavy lifting. So I would challenge the idea that's really fundamental to American policy for some generations now, that we have to make sure the world runs right. However, the main bad choices I think we could make would be in failing to develop a clear policy towards China, because I fear that when a crisis comes, as it could at any time, if we haven't thought this out, miscalculation and confusion becomes a lot easier and more dangerous. So I would focus on that as the main danger.
Yes, sir, right here on the aisle.
Yeah, hello, Mark Doyle. I'm a student at Rutgers University, a retired Army. My professor was kind enough to let me take the day off, my international strategic relations professors, to come to this conference. So my question is twofold. One is, to, I guess, Dr. Brett or whoever wants to answer this, what's your thoughts of allowing Japan to normalize? And are they becoming a new frontline state? And the second question is regarding nuclear second strike capability. I haven't heard a lot of anything from Defense Secretary Hagel about China's capabilities. I believe it's a J-7 submarine. It has ability to launch 12 intercontinental ballistic missiles with a 4,000-mile range, each with 1 megaton. What is the likelihood that they're going to bust out of the outer islands and we're going to be back into a former Cold War redo, as the Brigadier brought up, and chasing Chinese submarines around the world again, into the Atlantic and Pacific? Thank you.
Dr. Betts?
On Japan, I generally think American allies should do more, and we should do more to encourage or force them to do more, but Japan's an exception. I don't think it's a good idea for Japan to become a completely normal great power commensurate with its wealth in the sense of developing larger military forces, and especially nuclear weapons, because there are too many countries in Asia for whom that would be a big problem, or they would perceive it to be a big problem. So that's the one exception to my general view on that subject. I think Japan does just fine in terms of burden sharing at the moment. On the nuclear question, it seems to me since the Cold War, the United States is in a class by itself in terms of nuclear power. And with China, the main question is whether Chinese doctrine will change and they will become less satisfied with a minimal deterrent. And there, I think what happens with American development and deployment of ballistic missile defenses could play a big role in affecting Chinese incentives to reconsider the size of the force they need.
General Gregson, you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, let me comment that I think the allegation of Japan militarizing is greatly exaggerated and flat wrong. We have been urging Japan for a number of years to take more prudent actions in their self-defense, and the record shows that they're doing just that. The record also shows that no nation has a better record of pursuit of peace and cooperation than Japan over the last 70 years. Japan has a declining population. They're not going to be going abroad to find dragons to slay. They have enough challenge defending their own territory. On nuclear weapons, and related to the previous question about the United States being a guarantor of world order, it's a little difficult to see how Northeast Asia would retain some degree of stability were the U.S. not providing the nuclear umbrella to our allies there. That's not in a hostile fashion, it's just merely a deterrent, which I think is very valuable. When you look at Japan's position, they're right across the water from North Korea. Missile flight time, weapons flight time is measured in minutes, if not seconds, so there's a certain degree of integration necessary between U.S. forces and Japan and Japanese forces, and this is part of the intent of their re-look at collective defense. It makes absolutely no sense to have our very capable aircraft and Japan's very capable aircraft in the future, F-35s each, operating inside the Japanese air defense envelope, but not in an integrated fashion. It's impossible to do technologically. It's nonsense tactically and operationally. So that's the direction that things are going. The Japanese on December 17th announced a new national security strategy, a new national defense program guidelines, and the creation of a Japanese National Security Council to mirror ours. At the present, U.S. and Japan are doing the second ever rewrite of the Alliance Defense Guidelines this year in close collaboration, and I think what will come out of that by the end of the year is a profoundly defensive-oriented strategy. Not passive defense, active defense, but a defense-oriented strategy that will serve the needs of both our nations very well.
Yes, sir, right here.
Sure, Byron Callan, Capital Alpha Partners. General Gregson, can you elaborate on your comment that resources are going down? Is this a normal cyclical downturn from a period of conflict? Is there secular changes, other factors that may make this one different? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. There's a number of things within that, but let me first state for the record that I'm not advocating constitutional change. Our Constitution is not the problem on creating strategy. It's the bureaucracy that is a problem on creating strategy. The system operates to create the tyranny of the in-basket, where every target is a short-range target, and officers, like many sitting here, will find themselves desperately trying to create any additional time away from the tyranny of the in-basket in a series of increasingly endless meetings to reinvest in the intellectual capital. The opportunity within our federated system is that for practitioners within the system trying to bring some sense to our strategy development, there's the opportunity to break out of the bureaucratic box in the wiring diagram in whatever office you work for and coordinate informally, both inside and outside of the bureaucracy, to try and find people of like mind. Kennan's genius was the fact that he broke away, or was never within, the near-term temporal hand-wringing that was going on in the U.S. government in 1947, 48, 49, as we realized a new threat was emerging, but he had the vision to look out over the horizon, if you will, or get his head above the parapet and describe the overall problem. And he found a number of like-minded fellow travelers. The history of that era with Paul Nitze and others, along with Kennan, kind of reads like the second edition of the Founding Fathers of the United States, in my opinion. To your question, sir, about the resources going down, It's not just resources going down in an objective sense, but they certainly are. But I don't think it's cyclical when you start looking at the increasing cost over a number of decades on what we pay for principal end item and what we pay for the care and maintenance and recruiting and retention and retirement of every soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guardsman that we draw. This is not the end of the world, but it does mean that we have to be far more discerning about where we apply our resources, as I said, rather as opposed to not making a decision and buying a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the other thing, and then not ending up with something that is at least approximately suited to what we run into, as the last comment on the last slide from General Rigden.
All right, let's take two questions now. First over to the left, and then we'll come down to the front here. Sir.
Hi, my name's Colonel Todd Key. I'm from the Army staff, and thank you very much for your comments. General Gregson and Dr. Betts, so what's the role of the Army in the future? Is it Pacific Pathways, as USAWC has articulated? Is it the regionally aligned forces, as the chief has talked about? Is it security force assistance, which we've been doing? Is it decisive action, or is it tail over tooth? Thank you.
Sir?
Yeah, I'm Chris Miller from the Air Force Academy. Following up on Dr. Bett's point about a nuclear detonation changing the landscape, I'd be interested in the views of any of the panelists, given that the non-state actors is one corner of the map, as to what disincentives there are and whether we can create or increase any of them to keep that from happening from that corner of the map.
Allow General Gregson and then Dr. Betts, and then we can open it up.
The role of the Army might be a little bit or all of that. I would suggest that first step is trying to discern what the demand signal is from the often cited national command authorities. That can be a big or small group, as you know, and how to contribute to it. One of the strategic mistakes we could make is to have an enemy-centered policy. That's why I said that China is not the new Soviet Union. To put this in context, we grew up for 40 years with, or better, 70 years, with a villain right out of central casting. Everything we did in the Pentagon was geared to Soviet capabilities, and you could sell anything, you could buy anything you wanted or get the resources for it if you proved that this was effective against the Soviet Union. We had no economic relationship at all with the Soviet Union. They had an autarkic economy. They created the divide between the free world and the rest of it with their actions and immediately following World War II. It was not our enemy to make. They declared themselves an enemy. China is not the new Soviet Union. We have a strong economic relationship with China. The task is to be able to successfully reintegrate China into the international system, and the odds of doing that successfully are bad. More times than not in history, it's turned the other way around. Compounding that is, like I said, China's the fastest growing power in world history. We need to make sure that we are, throughout the world, but particularly throughout Asia, in a manner that is both a deterrent and a reassurance to our allies and friends, and support for the system, and also support for the successful reintegration of China. It was mentioned that depth in the future comes from, mass in the future comes from depth and resilience. Secretary Gates, before he left government, was advocating something called a widely distributed, politically sustainable, operationally resilient structure. If you buy my theory that weapons accurate at distance coupled with ubiquitous surveillance is going to make anything big and immovable a very lucrative target, then we're talking about taking our capabilities and distributing them from our bases in an agile, mobile fashion, and that means deployments in much smaller than folks of my age are comfortable with. We like to have everybody lined up in a formation so we can see 5,000 people on a unit run or something. It's not going to be that. It's going to be captains, lieutenants, it's going to be sergeants, it's going to be working with countries on what concerns them. Bangladesh is not particularly concerned with conventional invasion. Bangladesh is using their army, much like we used our army in the 1800s for nation building, so why not a squad of army engineers under the command of a sergeant helping the Bangladesh army to build houses? That's capacity building in a sense. The base is obsolete. Our habit of building capital B, large font, bold print bases is over. So we have to learn how to operate from the few bases that we have in a manner that is within that mantra that Secretary Gates advocated. What term one would put on that, don't know. I would tend to think that if we're talking about something new, that just tactically from inside the system, like you are, that avoiding terms that have been used before that have become corrupted and misunderstood. I mean, we're still trying to understand Clausewitz, and how many years later are we doing that? So I'd come up with something else, but I would look at the assurance side, the development side, and aside from China, China and the U.S. have a decided, profound common interest in avoiding conflict between or among other nations out there. I mentioned that Southeast Asia is the fastest growing place in the world with a number of unsettled national boundaries, plus all the issues of water stress, of population rising, fisheries being depleted, natural resource needs, those types of things. So there's plenty of things there for all of us to try and make, number one, the reintegration of China come out successfully rather than going to the opposite extreme, which is the mixture of deterrence and reassurance. And number two, then below the level of U.S.-China things, making sure that we're implementing an Asia-oriented policy, not a China-oriented policy.
Dr. Betts?
The question about the Army's future is especially difficult because the shrinkage of the Army is virtually given. How much is uncertain, but it's bound to be substantial because of the overwhelming economic pressures to cut spending in general, and because the predictable sorts of threats seem to be ones that put more of a burden on air and naval power. But it's the unpredictable threats that the Army has to, in some sense, be ready for. And to me, that means maintaining a nucleus of capabilities in as many dimensions as possible, which is quite difficult when you're shrinking. But the Army can't control the demands that will be placed on it. The Army doesn't get to decide where it's told to fight. So, for example, the second round of disillusionment with counterinsurgency doesn't mean that at some point in the future, I suspect it'll be longer than the next 5 to 7 years, though, but that at some point it will be called upon to do that again. And this means to me something of a mobilization orientation, which is pretty difficult to organize, especially when it's also important to maintain the capability to actually handle a significant conventional contingency. Korea looks like the one we're used to and that remains by default. The more demanding one would be Iran, which I think would be a mistake to invade and occupy Iran, but stranger and less anticipated demands have happened to the Army before.
Brigadier Rigden, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, Doyle, I'd like to just say a few things. I think it's a dilemma, because I think for all of our armed forces, and particularly armies around the world, especially in Western Europe, when you come out of a transition out of 2 enduring land campaigns into an environment which I mentioned at the beginning is fairly uncertain, it's not as clear-cut. In the Cold War days, it was pretty easy for us to determine where that effort should be and what the overall strategy would be in terms of containment, for example, as Ray Millen gave us yesterday. The issue, I think, and that's why we've tried to sort of, in our calculations, try to look at what it is, what is the purpose of the armed forces. And I say, if it's for us, homeland defense, projecting power overseas in terms of national interest and forward engagement, those are the 3 key elements to us. The issue on national interest, I think for the states is an interesting one, because if you take Lord Palmerston in the 1800s, who said that we have no national interests. Our interests are everywhere and they are eternal. And that's pretty much the position in many ways that we, the West, have looked at America to deliver over that period. Now we're coming to an era where we have to refine more carefully, I think, how we interact with the world. We can't do it in the way that things we used to do in the past. we have to look at it in a very different way and deliver the effects we want to achieve, especially in terms of influence, differently. In terms of Army specifically, within those three balls, what is the elements that the Army physically has to do? And I think, let's take again, power projection overseas. It comes back to the question which the General raised about strategy specifically and grand strategy. The House of Commons Defence Committee recently in the UK did a really good study into the term strategy with the great historian Sir Hugh Strachan from Oxford University, among others. And in that, we deduced that we didn't really like the term grand strategy because it had sort of imperial connotations. But nevertheless, there is an overarching sort of vision, I think, that perhaps the UK has had but never stated since 1945. And I think it's very applicable for America. And it depends how you define grand strategy. I look at grand strategy as a conversation, a vision of how we want to operate, live, communicate, survive within the world that we live in. And then the national security strategy is your tweak on the tiller-specific strategies to deal and deliver that effect. And so if you look at the kind of unwritten grand strategy, and I think this is very important for how you then use force and use the military in particular, I would say that in America's case, and certainly in ours in an unwritten way, the first part of that grand strategy is to maintain the international state system and the international order in terms of legal basis. That's what we all want to do. We know that that system works. It has its faults, but it does work. And being able to put pressure and influence states to operate in particular ways and vice versa is an important part of that. The second piece, to quote Sun Tzu, if you don't work through friends and alliances, you will never achieve what you want to achieve. So you have to operate through friends and alliances. And therefore, in the case of the United States, your pivotal role in alliances, for example, within NATO specifically, but also your relationships with people like Japan, actually become very, very important regionally as to how you might influence and how your military forces might be used. The third one in your case, in our case, I think it is more a question of being a global player, would be the third element rather than a global power. 100 years ago it would have been different, but I think now global player is more appropriate. And therefore we have to use our power intelligently and apply it in a slightly different way. For America, it's very much about maintaining its position as a global power, but it will probably no longer be the hegemon. And certainly all the evidence is going towards the rise and balance of power towards the East more significantly. And the fourth one, which I think is always difficult to implement, but I think it is important, is that whatever grand strategy we have, it has to be underlined by a moral and ethical baseline. And we represent a nation that we want others to emulate. We represent nations that we want others to emulate. I don't necessarily mean in the democratic ideal, etc., but in terms of having some form of representation, in terms of being able to be at peace with your neighbors, we do represent that. And that moral ethical baseline, I think, is quite an important one to take forward, certainly in the way that other people interact and look at us as nations within the West. So if you accept that as the basis in terms of a broad grand strategy, then every 5 years or every review, quadrennial review, whatever, the strategy that we develop tweaks us along that line, because those are enduring in the way that the Palmerston said, not just national interest, but we're focusing it slightly more where we need to be. Then based on that line, you can then work out, I think, what it is that our armed forces are for. And I think one of the issues with the armed forces in particular is that we have greater utility than just our foundation skill of warfighting. And that is very much a last resort. And we certainly find, as within NATO, most of our European, all of us within NATO, are downsizing our armies to armies specifically for good reason, for very good reason. But we are relying on each other more clearly to deliver that effect. And we want to do it collegially through an alliance is probably the best way of delivering that effect. There are all sorts of implications of that. Do you then specialize in particular elements of what armed forces can do? But collectively, we have quite a lot of capability. And we mentioned, I think all of us actually mentioned things like global warming, climate change, flooding, increase of water levels, etc., lack of resources. There are many areas in which we may be involved. I think the final thing I would say is to do with the issue about mass. And I think within the US in particular, one of your principles of war is mass. Our equivalent of that is concentration of force. but it's used in an operational and tactical sense rather than necessarily, and strategically as well, but specifically operational and tactical. And I think the issue with mass is very difficult. We all tend to immediately come back to mass. We must have more of this, must have more of that. And we define mass in those terms, in terms of quantity, although we want to match it with quality as well. The issue, I think, for mass is, and this is why I raised the issue about depth and resilience. If you take the US Army's great mantra, the battle after next, we need to be able to operate in the here and now, survive and prevail over what happens next, and be preparing for what happens after that as well. That is the case with depth and resilience. If we have a strategic shock, as we did with 9/11, and with us with 7/7, et cetera, in UK and Spain, if you have that strategic shock, how do you bounce back from that shock? What do you actually have that allows you to have the resilience to regenerate, to deal with that issue? That is your justification for why you might need mass, and it would determine the size of that mass. Whereas we tend automatically to go straight away, we must have more of this or preserve what we have. And actually the balance within that mass may not be what we want it to be, instinctively, in gut feeling. Within the British Army, we have a regimental system which we try to protect at all costs. And there's a good reason for that, because as an institution, that's what gives us our sort of ethos and our philosophy. But there are balances to be made within defense that actually may take us down a different route. So, for example, the emphasis on things like forward engagement. What is the issue in terms of defense and where we employ that force in forward engagement versus high readiness forces that can deploy to do the worst case warfighting, but in the best case, other tasks which have greater utility for the world.
General Gregson, you want to respond?
On the nuclear detonation, if there was one, we would be totally unprepared to deal with it, and I cite the effective but still ad hoc reaction to the 3/11 complex disaster in Japan. Combined with that, the non-proliferation treaty seems to be breaking down. This would make it, along with every other arms control treaty, where none have lasted forever. We know about Iran. We know Saudi Arabia is very worried about Iran going nuclear. You can build a chain. So this is something we need to look at, not just for an intentional detonation, but with more and more countries building more and more nuclear plants, there's an argument here for at least a national response framework from the United States, because no nuclear accident stays within one national boundary, but perhaps also an international response framework, and that's not moving very fast at all.
We'll give the very last word to my partner on this panel, Dan Flynn.
Just on the question of nuclear weapons, I wouldn't portray it just as a non-state problem. I'm worried about some of the state strategies that are developing. Russian strategists have been running for years now the idea of using very low-yield tactical nuclear weapons to de-escalate a conflict with a conventional military power. They think it will de-escalate because we won't bring it to an escalated strategic level. If that concept gets adopted by other states, other nuclear powers, that they think limited nuclear warfare is possible again, then that's something that's of concern. So that's something we need to watch going forward as well.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the demands of the schedule dictate that I bring this panel to a close. I want to thank the National Intelligence Council, the partner for this panel, and of course, Dan Flynn, but I'd ask you to join me now in thanking all of our panelists for sharing their wisdom and insights.